That morning, the sunlight filtering through the blinds seemed sharper than usual, cutting into my thoughts as I sipped my coffee. Zaira had already left for her morning fitness class, her usual routine of yoga, Pilates, or whatever she claimed helped her center herself. I didn't think much about it until I began cleaning the house, a ritual that had become mine in recent months since we agreed she would focus more on her work and self-care while I handled the small chores. While organizing the bathroom cabinet, a white box caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just another one of Zaira's beauty products. She had a habit of hoarding skincare and wellness items. I almost ignored it, but something about the way it was stashed behind her toiletries made me pause. Reaching for it, I was met with a nervous flutter in my chest. When I opened the box, my world shifted in an instant. Inside was a pregnancy test. Positive. I froze, the small piece of plastic resting in my palm like a live wire. My mind raced, but the loudest thought was the simplest. This isn't possible. Zaira and I had talked about children long ago. An honest, heart-to-heart discussion about what we both wanted. Back then, we agreed we loved our freedom, our careers, our shared passion for travel. Children didn't fit into that picture. I'd taken steps to make that agreement final. A vasectomy, 2 years ago. I hadn't told her because it wasn't something I wanted to debate. I thought I was sparing us both. Now, staring at the undeniable result in my hand, I felt the weight of my decision bear down on me like a tidal wave. Maybe there was another explanation. Maybe she'd been holding this for a friend. Maybe it wasn't recent, and she forgot to throw it away. I clung to these possibilities like a drowning man grips a life raft. But they slipped through my fingers as reality sank in. I put the test back exactly where I'd found it, my movements slow and deliberate, as though any sudden motion might cause the fragile foundation of my life to crumble entirely. Then I sat on the edge of the bathtub, head in my hands, trying to make sense of the impossible. That evening, Zaira came home, glowing from her workout. She looked effortlessly beautiful, her skin flushed and hair tied back in a loose braid. She placed her gym bag by the door and walked into the kitchen with her usual air of confidence, chatting about her day. "Mark, my client, wants to book another 3-month package," she said, opening the fridge. "He said I've completely changed his life. Isn't that sweet?" I nodded, barely registering her words. "Yeah, sounds great." She paused, looking over her shoulder. "You okay? You're quiet." "Just a lot on my mind," I replied, forcing a smile. She didn't press further, instead grabbing a yogurt and plopping onto the couch, scrolling through her phone. I watched her, trying to find a crack in her seemingly flawless demeanor, but there was nothing. Her expression was relaxed, carefree even. As the night wore on, my unease grew. Was this all a misunderstanding? Or was Zaira capable of hiding something so monumental? I needed answers, but I knew this wasn't the time to ask. Not yet. For now, I let the question simmer, knowing the truth would surface sooner or later. The following morning, I woke up early, unable to shake the restless thoughts from the night before. Zaira was still asleep, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm so peaceful it felt almost mocking. I made breakfast in silence, my mind a whirlpool of doubt and dread. When she finally walked into the kitchen, wearing one of her oversized sweaters and rubbing sleep from her eyes, I studied her every move. "Morning," she said with a lazy smile, leaning against the counter as she poured herself some coffee. "Morning," I replied, forcing a casual tone. She seemed normal. Too normal. My mind replayed the discovery of the test like a broken record, but I kept my face neutral. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I needed to approach this carefully, to understand the full picture before making a move. "Any plans today?" I asked, pretending to be engrossed in my toast. "Work as usual," she said, sipping her coffee. "And then probably a quick gym session with KLYR. You know, he's been upping my routines lately. It's brutal, but I can already feel the results." There it was, a name I'd heard before. KLYR Drinovic, her fitness trainer. She'd started working with him about a year ago, and his name often came up in our conversations. At first, it had been casual mentions of their sessions or diet tips he'd shared. But over time, his name slipped into her stories more frequently, usually accompanied by laughter or admiration. I never thought much of it. After all, she had a magnetic personality and thrived on connecting with others. But now, the mention of him triggered something different. A flicker of unease. "That guy's really making you work, huh?" I said, testing the waters. She laughed. "Oh, he's relentless. But he knows his stuff. He's got this way of pushing you just far enough without breaking you. It's why he's the best." I nodded, chewing slower, her words settling like a stone in my stomach. I couldn't accuse her outright. Not yet. But the test and the sudden clarity of my own intuition were painting a picture I didn't like. After she left for work, I paced the living room, my thoughts spiraling. If she were hiding something, there had to be more evidence. But searching through her things felt wrong, a betrayal of trust, even if she'd already betrayed me. Still, I couldn't ignore the gnawing in my gut. I needed to know the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. With trembling hands, I sat down at her desk, opening her laptop. It wasn't something I'd ever done before. Zaira was protective of her privacy, and I respected that. But now, it felt like the only way forward. Her browser history was clear, as I expected. But as I opened her email, I found a trail of messages between her and KLYR. They weren't overtly incriminating, mostly casual exchanges about fitness routines and schedules. But one message stood out, buried under a pile of others. "Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again." The timestamp was from 2 weeks ago. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring. A part of me wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, that I was misinterpreting things. But the words were there, mocking me in black and white. My stomach churned as I sat back, running a hand through my hair. The pieces were starting to come together, and none of them pointed to a misunderstanding. When Zaira returned home that evening, I watched her more closely than ever, searching for cracks in her story. She moved with the same grace, her laugh as bright as always. But now, every word, every glance, felt like a performance. I needed more. One email wasn't enough. I had to be absolutely certain before I confronted her. Until then, I would bide my time, watching and waiting for the moment when her perfect facade would finally shatter. The weekend arrived with an unwelcome tension in the air. I tried to go about my day as usual. Laundry, organizing my workspace, and catching up on a project I'd been neglecting. But the email and that pregnancy test loomed over everything, a constant, invisible weight pressing down on me. Zaira, on the other hand, was her usual vibrant self, moving through the house like nothing was amiss. That Saturday morning, she dressed casually in a pair of leggings and a fitted hoodie, her gym bag slung over her shoulder. "I'm heading to the studio," she announced cheerfully, planting a kiss on my cheek as I washed dishes. "Another session with KLYR?" I asked, my voice deliberately light. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before answering. "Yeah, we're going over some new routines. He's been pushing me harder, and it's really paying off." Her pause didn't last long enough to catch someone off guard, but I noticed it. Something about the way she avoided eye contact, just for a moment, set my nerves on edge. I nodded, keeping my suspicions hidden behind a neutral expression. "Have fun," I said, drying my hands on a towel as she walked out the door. The moment it shut behind her, I moved. I had no time to waste. I headed straight for her gym bag, which she always left in the closet near the entryway. I hesitated for a second. This felt wrong, invasive, but the doubts swirling in my head drowned out the guilt. Inside, I found the usual, a water bottle, a clean towel, some energy bars. But at the bottom of the bag, buried beneath a tangle of workout clothes, was a second phone. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled it out, turning it over in my hands. It was sleek, newer than her primary phone, and completely password protected. My stomach churned as I stared at the blank screen, knowing what it meant but not wanting to admit it. Zaira had never mentioned owning another phone. There was no reason for her to have one unless she was hiding something. I put everything back exactly as I found it, careful to leave no trace of my rummaging. The phone went back into the gym bag, which I placed in the exact same spot. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the wall and trying to steady my breathing. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe there was a logical reason for the second phone. But combined with everything else, the test, the email, the growing distance between us, it felt like another piece of a puzzle I didn't want to complete. Zaira returned home later that afternoon, flushed and glowing from her workout. "Hey babe," she greeted, dropping her bag by the door. What's for lunch? I'm starving. I glanced at her, trying to gauge her mood. She was upbeat, relaxed, and completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I was thinking of making a salad, I replied, keeping my tone steady. Sounds perfect, she said, kicking off her shoes and padding over to the fridge. As she rummaged through it, humming a tune under her breath, I couldn't help but feel like I was living with a stranger. Over lunch, I decided to push a little, to see how far I could go before she raised her defenses. So, how's training with KLYR going? I asked casually, spearing a cherry tomato with my fork. She didn't miss a beat. Great. He's got me trying some new strength-building exercises. They're killer, but I think they'll really make a difference. No kidding, I said, smiling faintly. You two seem to spend a lot of time together. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, just for a second. Well, yeah, he's my trainer. It's his job. I nodded, keeping my tone light. You must really trust him. Of course, she said, her voice steady but her smile a little too perfect. He's a professional, VYNN. What's with all the questions? I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. Just curious. I've been thinking about hiring a trainer myself. Maybe I should talk to him. Her fork clattered against her plate. You don't need a trainer, she said quickly, her tone a touch too sharp. You're already in great shape. There it was again. Another crack in her perfect mask. I leaned back in my chair, studying her for a moment. You're right, I said with a small laugh. Just a thought. She relaxed visibly, the tension in her shoulders easing as she went back to her meal. But I wasn't done yet. That night, after she fell asleep, I crept into the closet and retrieved her gym bag. This time, I didn't hesitate. I took the second phone into my office and powered it on, knowing I was crossing a line but unable to stop myself. The lock screen was simple, just 4 digits. I tried a few combinations, her birthday, the date we met, the anniversary of her business, but none of them worked. Frustrated, I set the phone down and stared at it, wondering how much more I'd need to uncover before the truth finally revealed itself. For now, I had more questions than answers. But one thing was clear, whatever Zaira was hiding, it was only a matter of time before her secrets came to light. Sunday morning arrived in a subdued way. Zaira lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone, while I sat nearby with the newspaper open in my lap. The tension inside me simmered quietly, my thoughts still fixated on the second phone I had found in her gym bag. It felt like a puzzle piece, tantalizingly close to revealing the truth but just out of reach. She occasionally glanced at me, her expression curious, almost studying me. There was a casualness in her demeanor, but it felt calculated, as if she were testing the waters. I tried to focus on the printed words in front of me, but they blurred into nonsense. The rest of the day unfolded uneventfully on the surface. Zaira busied herself with small tasks, moving through the house with her usual grace. She called a friend in the afternoon, her voice lilting with laughter, then spent an hour stretching on her yoga mat in the living room. To anyone else, she would have seemed like a picture of calm contentment. To me, it felt like watching a performance. As the evening drew near, she suggested going out for dinner at a small restaurant we hadn't visited in months. It was framed as a casual invitation, the kind of spur-of-the-moment decision that used to feel natural between us. I agreed, deciding it was better to keep things appearing normal. At the restaurant, she was her usual self, chatting easily with the staff and commenting on the decor. I responded in kind, keeping my suspicions buried under a veneer of light conversation. But my mind stayed elsewhere, circling back to the unanswered questions that had been gnawing at me for days. Midway through our meal, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it quickly, her expression shifting in the briefest, almost imperceptible way. There was a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even concern, before she masked it with her usual smile. Picking up the phone, she read the message, her posture subtly changing as she turned her body slightly away from me. After a moment, she set the phone down, screen facing the table. The gesture wasn't unusual on its own, but it felt deliberate, like an act of concealment. Back at home, the unease I'd been suppressing all evening bubbled to the surface. While Zaira showered, I noticed her primary phone sitting on the coffee table. It was an opportunity one hadn't expected, and despite the guilt that clawed at me, I picked it up. Most of her messages were exactly as I expected. harmless exchanges with friends and work clients. But one stood out. It was marked by initials I immediately recognized, KD. The thread was sparse, with only a few messages visible, but one stood out clearly. Tomorrow at 4? Same place. The brevity of the message made it feel even more damning, as though it didn't need elaboration. My stomach churned as I locked the phone and placed it back where I'd found it, my mind racing. Zaira emerged from the bathroom a few minutes later, wrapped in a towel, her expression calm and relaxed. She greeted me with a smile, and though I nodded in response, inside I felt as though a chasm had opened between us. The night passed slowly. Zaira fell asleep with the ease of someone whose conscience was unburdened, but I stayed awake long after, my thoughts unraveling the careful facade of our life together. By morning, I had made up my mind. Whatever her plans were for 4 o'clock, I would find out. The cracks in her story were widening, and I wasn't going to look away. I watched her closely as she got dressed in the late afternoon, choosing a casual yet carefully coordinated outfit. She mentioned heading out for an errand, her tone breezy, as though it was no more significant than picking up groceries. I nodded absently, pretending to scroll on my phone, all the while mentally preparing for what I was about to do. When she left, I waited just long enough to avoid suspicion before grabbing my keys. Her car was easy to spot as she drove down the street, and I followed at a safe distance, keeping enough space to remain unseen. My heart pounded in my chest, every turn tightening the knot of tension in my stomach. She didn't go to any place we frequented, nor to a part of town we usually visited. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot of a boutique hotel nestled just out of the city's main hub. The building was modest yet refined, the kind of place where privacy was valued over flashiness. I parked farther down the street, watching as she stepped out of her car. Her movements were unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world. She walked inside without hesitation, her head held high. I stayed in my car for a few minutes, debating my next move. Every instinct screamed at me to confront her, to walk into that lobby and demand answers. But I couldn't act without proof. If I misstepped, she could twist the narrative, make me out to be paranoid or controlling. Instead, I got out of the car and approached the hotel's entrance, staying just out of sight. From the lobby's large windows, I caught a glimpse of her near the reception desk. She wasn't alone. Standing next to her, leaning in close as they spoke, was a man I immediately recognized. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a perfectly tailored jacket and an air of practiced confidence. Klyr Dranovic, her fitness trainer. I watched as they exchanged a few words, their expressions too familiar, their body language too comfortable. She laughed softly at something he said, her hand briefly touching his arm. My stomach churned, a bitter mixture of anger and betrayal rising in my throat. I stepped back quickly, not wanting to risk being seen. My mind raced as I returned to my car, my grip on the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I stayed parked for nearly an hour, watching the hotel's entrance from a distance. The minutes dragged on, each one a cruel reminder of what I had just witnessed. When she finally emerged, she was alone. Her face was serene, her movements unhurried as she walked back to her car. She drove home as though nothing had happened. That evening, I acted as though everything was normal. We ate dinner together, her voice filling the space with stories about her day. She was animated, smiling, her usual self. But all I could see was the image of her in that hotel lobby, laughing with a man I had trusted not just with her fitness but, unknowingly, with the fragile fabric of our marriage. Every word she spoke felt like a carefully placed brick, building a wall between the life we had and the truth she was hiding. The proof I needed was within reach now. It was only a matter of time before the cracks she had worked so hard to cover would give way entirely. The morning after seeing Zaira at the hotel, I woke with a sense of grim determination. Every breath felt heavier, every moment more deliberate. I knew what I'd seen, but without solid proof, any confrontation would spiral into deflections and denials. Zaira was skilled at maneuvering conversations, and I couldn't risk her twisting this into something I'd regret. I decided to focus on that second phone, the secret lifeline she had hidden in her gym bag. It felt like the key to everything. If there were messages, calls, or photos linking her to Klyr, or anyone else, it would be there. But I needed a way in. Zaira left mid-morning for another session with a client, giving me the opportunity one needed. I retrieved the phone from her gym bag and brought it to my office. This time, I was prepared. I had done some research the night before, learning about apps that could bypass basic locks on smartphones. It wasn't something I ever imagined I'd need to know, but now it felt like a lifeline. The process was slow, each step testing my resolve. I hesitated more than once, my conscience warring with my need for answers. But when the lock screen disappeared and the phone's contents loaded, a wave of conflicting emotions hit me all at once. Her call log was the first thing I checked. As expected, there were multiple calls to and from KLYR, most of them brief, some lasting well over an hour. Each timestamp felt like a slap, especially the ones marked late at night, long after I had gone to bed. Next, I moved to the messaging app. It was sparse, she had clearly deleted most of the conversations, but a few threads remained. The texts between her and KLYR were the most damning. One message stood out. "Last night was everything I needed. I can't wait until next time." My hands shook as I scrolled further. There were photos, too. A few innocuous selfies, Zaira in her workout gear, smiling at the camera. But then I found one of her and KLYR together, arms around each other in what looked like a gym mirror. Her expression was carefree, almost euphoric. His grin was wide, confident, as if he had nothing to hide. I closed the app and sat back, staring at the phone. The proof was undeniable now. Everything I had suspected, every doubt, every gnawing thought in the middle of the night had been confirmed. The anger came first, a white-hot surge that made my pulse pound in my ears. But it was quickly followed by something colder, something sharper. Clarity. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a choice she had made, over and over again. A choice to lie, to deceive, to walk away from the life we had built without a second thought. I put the phone back in her gym bag, returning it to its exact spot. She couldn't know I had found it yet. Not until I was ready. That evening, Zaira came home as if nothing had changed. She greeted me with her usual warmth, kissed my cheek, and set her bag down by the door. As we ate dinner, she talked about her day, filling the room with stories of her clients and their progress. I nodded along, my responses measured, my tone neutral. Inside, though, I felt like I was watching a stranger, someone who had mastered the art of pretending everything was fine. When she asked if I was okay, I simply said I was tired from work. It wasn't a lie, I was exhausted, but not for the reasons she thought. That night, as she slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The evidence was there, solid and irrefutable. But I couldn't confront her yet. I needed to think, to plan. Whatever came next, it had to be on my terms. She moved through the house that morning as if nothing had changed. She smiled at me over her coffee, her laugh light as she chatted about a new recipe she wanted to try. Every word, every gesture, felt rehearsed, a performance meant to keep me in the dark. I matched her tone, responding with the usual ease I'd perfected over the years. But behind my facade, my thoughts churned with the beginnings of a plan. After she left for the day, I sat at my desk, staring at the evidence I had uncovered on her second phone. The messages, the calls, the photos. They painted a picture of a relationship that had gone far beyond professional. It wasn't just infidelity, it was a betrayal of trust so complete it left no room for doubt. But I couldn't act impulsively. A confrontation without preparation would give her the chance to twist the narrative, to make excuses or place the blame on me. I couldn't let that happen. Instead, I began to strategize. The first step was securing control over our finances. Zaira and I shared accounts for most expenses, but I handled the bulk of the management. Over the years, I had set aside savings in separate accounts, precautions I thought of as routine but now realized were a lifeline. I spent the morning transferring funds, ensuring that my financial stability wouldn't be compromised no matter how things played out. Next, I gathered more evidence. I printed copies of the incriminating messages and photos, saving digital backups to a secure cloud account. If Zaira tried to deny or erase what I had found, I would have the proof ready. As I worked, I thought about KLYR. His involvement wasn't just personal, it was professional. If he had broken ethical boundaries with Zaira, chances were this wasn't his first time. The fitness industry thrived on reputation, and his could easily be dismantled if the truth came to light. I jotted down notes, outlining my next steps. A part of me still felt the sting of betrayal, but I buried it beneath the practicality of my task. There was no room for emotion now. That afternoon, I called an old friend, Elysia Montarik. Elysia was married to Klyr, or at least, she had been the last time we spoke. She was sharp, resourceful, and fiercely protective of her family. If anyone would want to know about his infidelity, it was her. The conversation began cautiously. I hadn't spoken to Elysia in months, and I approached the subject delicately, mentioning that I had concerns about Zyra's trainer and his involvement with certain clients. It didn't take long for Elysia to pick up on the subtext. Her voice grew quieter as she admitted she'd had suspicions of her own. She had noticed changes in her husband's behavior, late nights, secretive phone calls, but had dismissed them as stress from work. Now, hearing my story, the pieces began to click for her. By the end of the call, we had agreed to exchange information. I sent her copies of the messages and photos I had found, while she promised to share anything she uncovered on her end. It felt strange, forming an alliance with someone I barely knew. But Elysia's anger mirrored my own, and her determination to expose the truth gave me a sense of solidarity I hadn't realized I needed. That evening, Zyra returned home with the same effortless charm she always carried. She greeted me with a kiss, her expression warm and familiar. I nodded, playing my part, but inside, I felt like a predator circling its prey. She had no idea that the foundation of her lies was crumbling beneath her. No idea that the person she trusted to stay oblivious was now the architect of her undoing. As we sat down to dinner, she launched into a story about one of her clients, her voice animated and bright. I listened, nodding at the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere, focused on the days ahead. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. The following day, my resolve solidified. Every action I took felt deliberate, every thought focused on ensuring that what I did next would leave no room for doubt, no opening for Zyra to manipulate the situation. My mind cycled through everything I'd learned, the messages, the hotel, and the quiet, calculated way she had concealed her betrayal. Zyra left mid-morning, mentioning a meeting with a client. She smiled as she slipped on her jacket, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. I waited until her car disappeared down the street before reaching out to Elysia. She had sent me a text earlier that morning, asking for a phone call when I was free. As soon as I dialed her number, she picked up, her voice sharp with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "I've been digging into his phone records," she began without preamble. "There's a number that keeps showing up, yours." My stomach twisted at the confirmation. Zyra hadn't just been messaging Klyr casually. They had been in constant contact, enough to draw Elysia's attention before I'd even reached out. She detailed the times and durations of the calls, her tone growing colder with every word. We exchanged more information, piecing together a timeline that left little doubt about the extent of their relationship. Elysia, as thorough as I'd hoped, had also unearthed financial irregularities tied to her husband's business. Payments made to personal accounts disguised as training expenses, unexplained withdrawals, small at first, but adding up to something far larger. "If this gets out, he's done," she said flatly. "I can't believe he was stupid enough to leave a trail like this." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implications. It wasn't just about personal betrayal anymore. This was about exposing a man who had violated both professional and personal boundaries, leaving destruction in his wake. That afternoon, I reviewed the evidence Elysia had sent me. Screenshots of his financial transactions, logs of late-night calls, and a series of cryptic emails from an address I hadn't seen before. Together, it painted a picture of a man who had become reckless in his pursuit of whatever he thought he could take without consequence. But I wasn't finished. If I was going to confront Zyra, I needed to ensure that I had complete control of the situation. I began compiling everything I had, text messages, photos, financial records, into a single file. I uploaded it to a secure account, setting the groundwork for what would come next. Zyra returned home late in the afternoon, carrying bags from a shopping trip she hadn't mentioned earlier. She seemed relaxed, her expression free of worry as she unpacked her purchases on the kitchen counter. I watched her carefully, noting the small details, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, the way her hands moved just a little too quickly as she folded away the receipt. She was hiding something, even now, though she didn't yet realize that the facade was already cracking. During dinner, she mentioned another session with Klyr scheduled for the next day. She spoke casually, her voice light, as though his name carried no weight. I nodded, keeping my tone neutral. "Sounds good," I said, barely registering my own voice. Inside, I felt the weight of the decision I had made earlier that day. The truth was no longer something I needed to uncover. It was something I was ready to use. That night, as Zaira slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The plan was complete, the pieces in place. All that remained was to set everything into motion. The next time she left for one of her obsessions, I would ensure that her carefully constructed world began to unravel. She left the house around noon, dressed in workout gear and carrying her gym bag. The door shut softly behind her, and I stood still, listening to the faint hum of her car pulling away. Then I moved. I had already planned everything. Within minutes, I was in my car, tailing her at a safe distance. She drove out of the neighborhood and onto the main road, heading toward the boutique hotel I had seen her visit before. My hands tightened on the wheel as I followed, my thoughts a chaotic mix of anger, sadness, and cold determination. When she pulled into the hotel parking lot, I parked farther down the street, just as I had last time. I watched her step out of the car, her movements confident, her expression calm. She disappeared through the hotel doors without a second glance. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked into the hotel lobby, the cool air and polished floors feeling almost surreal. The receptionist looked up with a polite smile, but I ignored her, heading straight for the hallway where I had seen Zaira and Klyr last time. I didn't need to search long. The sound of quiet laughter filtered through a door left slightly ajar. My chest tightened as I approached, every step feeling heavier than the last. Through the narrow opening, I caught a glimpse of them, Zaira and Klyr, sitting close on a small couch, their heads tilted toward each other in quiet conversation. It wasn't just the proximity that struck me, it was the ease between them. The way she laughed softly at something he said, the way his hand rested casually on her knee. They weren't just hiding an affair, they were living it, comfortable in the lie they thought I'd never uncover. I pushed the door open fully, stepping inside. The sound startled them both, their heads snapping toward me in unison. Zaira's face went pale, her eyes wide with shock, while Klyr sat frozen, his hand still on her knee. The silence that followed felt endless. Zaira opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her expression shifted from surprise to something closer to panic as she rose from the couch. I held up a hand to stop her. The words I had prepared for this moment felt distant, rehearsed, but I forced them out anyway. "I know everything," I said, my voice steady. "The messages, the calls, the meetings. It's all right here." I held up the folder of evidence I had brought, letting it fall onto the coffee table between them. It landed with a dull thud, the weight of its contents echoing in the tense air. Zaira reached for it instinctively, her movements shaky, but I stepped back before she could speak. "Don't bother," I said sharply. "It's all backed up. Nothing you can say or do will make it go away." Her lips moved, forming the beginnings of a denial, but I cut her off. "Don't insult me by pretending this isn't what it looks like." Klyr finally found his voice, stammering something about misunderstanding the situation. His words were weak, his confidence gone. I didn't even look at him. My focus remained on Zaira, the woman I had once trusted above all else. Her face crumpled as the gravity of the situation sank in. She reached out toward me, her voice trembling as she tried to explain, to justify, to apologize. But it was too late. The damage was done. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them behind. As I stepped into the cool air outside, a strange sense of relief washed over me. The confrontation was over, and the truth was no longer hidden. Back in my car, I sat for a long moment, letting the events of the day settle. The next steps were already clear in my mind. This wasn't just about ending things with Zaira, it was about reclaiming control over my life. She thought she could keep everything hidden, but now the truth was out. And this was only the beginning of the consequences she would face. Driving home, the confrontation replayed in my mind, every detail sharp and vivid. Zaira's face, pale and stricken. Klyr, fumbling for words that never came. The weight of the evidence crashing down on them both. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was hollow. When I reached the house, I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the driveway. It looked the same as it always had, calm, welcoming, deceptively normal. But I knew nothing about my life was normal anymore. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling upward. For the first time in weeks, there was nothing left to question. The truth was laid bare. Now, I had to decide what to do with it. Zaira came home hours later. The sound of the door opening was louder than usual, her footsteps hesitant as she entered the house. She didn't call out like she normally would, didn't ask about my day or make some light-hearted comment. Instead, she appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face drawn and her eyes rimmed with red. I didn't look at her at first, keeping my focus on the cup in my hands. The silence between us was suffocating, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on the room. Finally, she spoke, her voice breaking as she tried to apologize. She used words like mistake and confused, phrases meant to soften the betrayal, to shift some blame onto circumstances instead of choices. But I wasn't interested in her explanations. Without looking up, I cut her off, telling her I wasn't ready to hear anything she had to say. She faltered, her voice trailing off into silence. Over the next few days, the house became a battlefield of quiet tension. Zaira tried to talk to me several times, but I kept my responses short, cold, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she seemed desperate to provoke. Meanwhile, I stayed in close contact with Alizia. She was already taking steps to confront Klyr, preparing her own legal and personal battle against the man who had betrayed her. She thanked me for sharing what I'd found, her voice steely with determination. In one call, she mentioned she had filed for divorce and was meeting with a lawyer about the financial fraud she had uncovered. Her resolve was inspiring, a sharp contrast to the chaos I felt inside. Late one night, I found myself sitting in the living room, scrolling through old photos of Zaira and me. There we were at our wedding, her smile radiant as she looked at me with what I thought was love. Vacations, family gatherings, quiet moments at home. All of it felt like a distant memory, like looking at someone else's life. The person in those photos wasn't the person who had hidden a second phone, sent secret messages, and met a man at a hotel. That woman was a stranger, and it was that realization that solidified my decision. The next morning, I told Zaira I wanted her to leave. The words were calm but firm, leaving no room for negotiation. Her reaction was a mixture of shock and desperation, her pleas tumbling out in rapid succession. She promised to cut off contact with Klyr, to do whatever it took to fix what she had broken. But I didn't waver. I told her that trust wasn't something that could be repaired with words or promises. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. By the end of the day, she was gone. The house was quiet again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the oppressive silence of tension but the stillness of a new beginning. I didn't feel victorious or even relieved. What I felt was freedom, tempered by the weight of what I had lost. The house felt cavernous after Zaira left. Every room seemed quieter, every corner heavier with memories of a life that no longer existed. Her absence wasn't a relief, not yet. It was a stark reminder of how much had changed in so little time. I spent the first couple of days in a haze, going through the motions of work and chores without much focus. My mind was too busy replaying everything, dissecting every conversation, every moment that should have been a red flag but wasn't. Zaira tried reaching out. Texts, a voicemail, even an email, but I didn't respond. I couldn't. There was nothing left to say. One afternoon, as I sorted through the closet, I came across an old box filled with keepsakes from the early years of our relationship. Movie stubs, postcards from vacations, little notes we used to leave for each other. I sat on the floor and sifted through it all, the weight of nostalgia settling over me like a heavy blanket. At some point, I came across a note Zaira had written on our first anniversary. It was a simple, heartfelt message about how grateful she was for the life we were building together. The words felt hollow now, as if they had come from a different person entirely. I folded the note and put it back in the box, setting it aside. There would be time to sort through all of it later, but not now. Alizia called that evening with an update on her end. She sounded sharper than before, her focus now fully on holding Klyr accountable. She'd confronted him, laying out all the evidence of his infidelity and the financial irregularities she had uncovered. He tried to deny it at first, she said, her voice laced with disdain. But when I showed him everything, he folded. He knows he's caught, and there's no getting out of it. I told her about Zaira leaving, and she offered a quiet word of support. It gets easier, she said after a pause. Not right away, but eventually. There was something reassuring about hearing that from someone who was going through the same pain. In the days that followed, I began the process of rebuilding. I moved through the house, clearing out the remnants of Zaira's presence. Her clothes, her toiletries, even the gym bag that had held the second phone. Each item I boxed up felt like a small step toward reclaiming the space, making it my own again. I started spending more time with friends, something I hadn't realized I'd neglected during my marriage. At first, it was difficult to explain what had happened. People who had seen Zaira and me together always assumed we were the perfect couple, and their shock mirrored the disbelief I had felt when I first uncovered the truth. But with each retelling, it became easier. The burden of secrecy lifted, replaced by a strange kind of clarity. One night, I found myself on a long walk through the neighborhood, the cool air bracing and refreshing. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but I knew I wasn't going to let the past define it. The betrayal had changed me, yes, but it hadn't broken me. If anything, it had shown me just how much I could endure, and how much more I deserved. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the wounds began to scab over. Life didn't return to normal. Normal no longer existed, but it found a new rhythm, one built on self-reliance and quiet reflection. The house, once filled with memories of a shared life, became a space that reflected me alone. I kept busy, throwing myself into work and rediscovering old hobbies. I started running again, something I hadn't done in years, and spent more time with friends who reminded me of the person I'd been before my world unraveled. Elysia and I kept in touch. Our shared experience created an unspoken bond, one rooted in the mutual understanding of betrayal. She had finalized her divorce from KLYR, and with the financial evidence she'd gathered, she'd ensured that his reputation, and his business, were left in tatters. In one of our conversations, she told me she was considering moving to a new city to start fresh. "There's nothing tying me here anymore," she said, her voice lighter than I'd ever heard it. I encouraged her. If anyone deserved a fresh start, it was her. Zaira's messages became less frequent over time. The desperation in her words gave way to resignation, then silence. I never responded, knowing that engaging with her would only reopen wounds I was trying to let heal. One day, a letter arrived from her, handwritten, pages long. It sat unopened on the counter for nearly a week before I finally read it. In the letter, she admitted everything. The affair, the lies, even the moments of guilt she claimed to have felt but ignored. She apologized, saying she never meant to hurt me, that she had been lost and made choices she couldn't undo. There was no anger left in me as I read her words, only a dull ache of what might have been. By the time I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in the box of keepsakes, a relic of a chapter one had no desire to revisit. Life didn't change overnight, but it did change. I found joy in small things. Morning coffee on the porch, a good book, the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd made it through the worst and come out stronger. One evening, I stood in the backyard, the cool breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The betrayal had left scars, yes, but they were a part of me now, reminders of lessons learned and resilience found. I wasn't defined by what had happened. I was defined by what I chose to do next.